The third chapter of Bava begins to deal with questions of title to land. So, from a thematic point of view, I suppose we could say that we've been exploring responsibilities of neighboring landowners. And that's very much the content of the first two chapters. So, the third chapter then goes into questions of ownership. Let's say there are two people claiming a piece of land. Well, who really owns it? And by the way, we'll see that the rest of the tractate of Bava continues to look at all kinds of boundary conditions or liminal situations in terms of ownership and responsibility. So we'll end up eventually in inheritance. It's almost as if we are tidying up, we are finishing off the three tractates of Nazikin, the three tractates of civil law. And we're tidying up all of these liminal, these edge case situations. So the third chapter is going to deal with questions of title where there are no documents. And we don't have any verses, by the way, to base ourselves on. Really interesting, the whole of this section of the Torah isn't learned out from Psukim. But I wanted to point out a comment in the Mishneh Torah at the beginning of the 11th chapter, Hilchot To'en Venitan, the laws about someone who makes a claim or who defends a claim. And he says, Kol hakarkaot hayeduot levalehen, any land that is known to be with an owner, afal pi shehen atatachat yad acherim, even if someone else is living on it, it's assumed to be owned. It's assumed to be owned by the owner. If we know that a piece of land is owned by the owner, we assume that he owns it, even if someone else is living on it. Now, normally, if someone else was living on it and had, for example, bought the land, well, we would assume that they had some document. Generally, land changes hands via document. So we'd assume that he has a document. But perhaps, and this is the situation which the Gemara envisages, perhaps he doesn't, perhaps he's lost the document. There's a suggestion, for example, that people are careful to keep documents for 1 or 2 years, but maybe after more than 3 years, they no longer have the document. And so the Mishnah envisages a situation in which someone might want to prove his ownership of land, not because he's known as the owner, but because he's lived there. And we're going to ask, well, okay, how long do you have to live on a piece of land to acquire title to it? That's the question at the beginning of this chapter in the Mishnah. How long do you have to occupy a piece of land in order to demonstrate that you have title, that you are the owner, in the absence of any other documentary evidence? And the Mishnah is going to begin. Chezkat, batim borot. There's now a whole list of objects, but a chazakah is the presumption of ownership, i.e., we don't have a document, but we are presumed to own something. The presumption of ownership for houses, borot, and cisterns. And then a whole list of other things, shichin, trenches, umarot, caves, martzachiot, bathhouses, shochabot, dovekats, beit habadim, olive presses, beit hashlachin, these are irrigated fields, avadim, slaves. And this rings out of character for us now, but of course, a slave can't be, the ownership of a slave can't be transferred just by picking him up or her up. They're typically transferred by documents. So for slaves, anything that regularly produces produce or produces a yield, anything with regular yield, anything of this kind, for its presumption of ownership, requires 3 years. And the Mishnah says, umiyom leyom, for day to day, which I have translated here as 3 complete years. In other words, you have to be there for 3 full years. You have to be sitting there. You have to occupy it for 3 full years. And the assumption, by the way, is that if someone else had owned that land, well, they have 3 years to object. They have 3 years to stand up and say, well, no, I'm the owner of this land and you're not. So there is some rationale behind the 3 years. In addition to the fact that inside 3 years, someone might be expected to be carrying a document, whereas after 3 years, we allow for the possibility that the document no longer exists. Remember, there's no central land registry at this time. So we rely on individuals taking care of their documents. After 3 years, we allow the possibility that the individual might have lost the document, and we're going to rely then on his or her occupancy of the land. This is for something that for a piece of land that produces continually. So what about something which is seasonal? Well, let's keep going. Sedeh haba cheskata shalosh shanim ve'ena miyom leyom. For Sedeh Habal is a field that just relies on rainwater. So it's only productive for a few months every year, right at the beginning of the growing season. It's not continually productive because we can't irrigate it. And it's not like an olive press, which you can use every day, or a slave who might work for you every day, or a dovecot with doves that might produce doves every day. A field which lacks irrigation is only going to be useful in the rainy season, and you might only occupy it in the rainy season. So we can see the logic of the Mishnah. Cheskata shalosh shanim, it's a 3-year presumption of ownership. Ve'ena miyom leyom, it's not from day to day, i.e., we don't require continuous settlement, continuous ownership. Someone might come in when it's wet, grow a crop, and then go away for a year. And let's just ask what this means. Well, we'll bring various opinions. Rabbi Ishmael Omer, Shlosha chodashim barishona u'shlosha chodashim ba'achrona. Rabbi Ishmael says 3 months in the first year. So we're there for 3 months. We harvest our crop. 3 months in the last year. That's the 3rd year. We harvest our crop. U'shnei chodesh, and 12 months. And now I'm filling in a gap in the Kaufman manuscripts. U'shnei chodesh ba'emtza, 12 months in the middle year. That is to say, shmona asar chodesh, which makes 18 months. So Rabbi Ishmael is saying, look, in order to demonstrate 3 years of ownership, we don't need 3 continuous years. We can be there for 3 years in one winter, and then 12 months. For 3 months, one winter, and then a whole year, 12 months, and then 3 months, I guess, right at the end of the next winter. So we kind of catch 2 growing seasons, and we have a full year in the middle. That's what we require to demonstrate ownership. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, Chodesh echad barishona, v'chodesh echad ba'achron. Rabbi Akiva says 1 month in the first year and 1 month in the last year. U'shnei masar chodesh ba'emtza, 12 months in the middle. Clearly, we need something in the middle. Arba'a asar chodesh, that makes 14 months. Amar Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael says, B'mei dvarim amorim, what are we talking about here? Rabbi Ishmael says, when does this apply? Bistei halavan, this applies to a white field. A white field in the language of the Mishnah is essentially a sown field, a field that's sown with wheat or with crops. In other words, it's white because it doesn't have shadows on it. It's not like trees. A white field is a sown field. So all this applies to a sown field. We're going to take advantage of the short period of rain to produce our crops. But if we're talking about trees, well, this is different because trees can produce right through the year. They're not dependent on some sudden rush of rain. Their roots go deep. So he says, Bisteh halavan, this applies to Sedeh halavan, to the white field, the sown field. Aval, but Bisteh ha'ilan, with a tree field, in other words, with an orchard, or this could be a vineyard too. We'll see, it could be a vineyard. Anas et tuato, he brought in his produce. And there's a verse in Deuteronomy that equates the word tevuah, produce, to the produce of a vineyard. So the rabbis assume here we're talking about produce, grape produce. He brings in his produce, i.e., his grapes. Umasak et zeytav. He collected his olives. He's crushed his olives. Hanas et kaitzor. He's gathered in his figs. So these are three kinds of produce from trees that we're thinking about. We're not thinking about apples and pears in the time of the Mishnah. We're thinking about grapes and olives and figs. These are the classic tree fruits. Harei elu shalosh shanim. This counts as 3 years. In other words, for a tree field, we're not going to count the months, but we are going to count the harvests. And once he's brought in 3 harvests, then we assume that he's the owner of the field.